The front of St. Augustine Church buzzed with life. Cars pulled into the parking lot, polished shoes clicked against the pavement, and women in designer dresses clustered in lively groups. Laughter drifted through the air as families gathered. For the Sunday service, children darting between the adults in their best clothes. In the middle of it all, Maria Langford walked slowly toward the church entrance. She adjusted the sleeve of her simple blue dress, her worn but carefully polished shoes stepping lightly across the concrete. Both hands gripped the strap of her old brown purse, holding it close to her body like a shield. There was a quiet steadiness. In her movement, a woman trying to blend in without drawing attention. As Maria reached the top step, a group of ushers stood posted at the large wooden doors. One of them, a senior usher with silver hair and a crisp black suit, stepped forward, abruptly, extending an arm across her path. He spoke loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Our church maintains a certain decorum. You cannot come in dressed like that." A hush fell over the entrance. Conversations halted. Heads turned. A few people exchanged glances and muffled laughs. A woman leaned toward her friend and whispered, just loud enough, "Probably here for a handout." "Look at her shoes." Maria said nothing. Her face remained still, but her hands gripped her purse even tighter, the knuckles turning white. She held her ground for a brief moment, standing against the wall of judgment gathering around her. A teenage choir volunteer stood nearby, holding his hymn book loosely. His eyes flicked from the senior usher to Maria and back again. His body shifted uncomfortably, but he said nothing, keeping his gaze lowered. The senior usher stiffened his posture, lowering his voice just enough to sound polite but firm. "We have a special service today. Perhaps you could return another time, appropriately. Prepared." The few steps Maria had taken toward the door felt like 100 miles now. Eyes pressed into her from every direction, polite smiles covering judgment, curiosity, and amusement. A man just inside the church discreetly pulled out his phone, pretending to check messages, but angling his camera at the scene. Maria didn't plead, didn't argue. She simply inhaled deeply, lifted her chin slightly, and turned back the way she came. The heavy wooden doors groaned and slammed shut behind her with a hollow booming sound that echoed across the courtyard. She walked away from the church, her steps steady, head low. No tears fell, no sobs escaped, but the small tremble in her hand as she adjusted her purse strap betrayed the effort it took to remain composed. At the edge of the parking lot, a battered old bus stop bench sat under the shade of a wilting tree. Maria crossed the street and sat down slowly, the sun catching on the small scuffs in her shoes. She folded her hands neatly in her lap, fixing her gaze somewhere distant and invisible. Across the street, the teenager who had watched earlier now sat on the low stone wall near the parking lot, staring at his phone. The short clip he had recorded played again and again, the moment Maria was turned away. His face showed a flicker of something, maybe shame, maybe guilt, before he lowered the device and looked back toward the closed church doors. Maria remained seated, perfectly still. The buzz of conversation from the church faded behind her. A bus in the distance screeched to a stop, the brakes whining in protest. The sharp metallic sound cut across the heavy, humid air, matching the invisible weight pressing down on her. She didn't move to board the bus. She didn't move at all. She simply sat there, the forgotten woman in the plain blue dress beneath the shadow of a church that had decided she didn't belong. The final image. A small figure sitting quietly at a battered bus stop, dignity intact, but isolated, while behind her, the bells of St. Augustine chimed, announcing the start of a service she would not be allowed to attend. Maria returned to the small apartment she shared with her husband, her steps slow and deliberate. She closed the door behind her with a soft click, slipping off her shoes and setting them neatly by the entrance. The aroma of fresh coffee lingered in the air, and from the kitchen, Nathaniel Langford looked up from the newspaper he was reading. He caught the way Maria moved, the tightness in her shoulders, the careful way she avoided making eye contact. He set the paper down and leaned casually against the counter. "Tough service today?" he asked lightly. Maria gave a small shrug, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's nothing. she said, her voice almost too even. Just the usual. Nathaniel didn't push. Instead, he moved around the counter and started pouring her a cup of coffee. He placed it on the table and waited. Maria sat down slowly, rapping, her hands around the mug as if trying to warm herself. She stared at the dark liquid, then said quietly, "I went to St. Augustine's today." Nathaniel stayed silent. "They wouldn't let me in." Her fingers tightened slightly around the cup. "Said I wasn't presentable enough." Nathaniel's jaw clenched, but his voice remained calm. "And you said?" Maria gave a soft, humorless laugh. "What could I say? They made it clear I wasn't. Welcome, loud enough for everyone to hear." Nathaniel nodded slowly. He moved back to the kitchen counter, picking up his phone without a word. "You're not upset?" he asked over his shoulder. Maria shook her head. "I'm used to it." Nathaniel dialed a number, waiting for the line to connect. "Doesn't mean you should be," he said quietly. Maria didn't ask who he was calling. She didn't need to. Years of marriage had taught her when Nathaniel's calm turned purposeful. Across town, the bells of St. Augustine Church rang out, the service well underway. Inside, the same ushers who had turned Maria away now stood proudly at their posts, greeting families with wide smiles and polite nods. The young choir volunteer from earlier sat stiffly in the third row, fidgeting with the sleeve of his robe. He hadn't slept well the night before. The image of Maria standing silently at the church doors refused to leave his mind. He glanced toward the entrance, half hoping to see her walk through, but the doors remained firmly closed. By early afternoon, the service ended and the church buzzed with talk of upcoming events, a charity fundraiser, a gala dinner. Flyers were passed out, excitement growing. No one noticed the black SUV that pulled up across the street. No one saw the man in a crisp, tailored suit step out, holding a thick leather folder under one arm. Nathaniel Langford didn't rush. He crossed the street at an easy pace, pausing at the bottom of the church stairs. The same senior usher from before spotted him and moved to greet him with a professional smile. "Welcome, sir," the usher said, straightening his tie. "Are you here for the event registration?" Nathaniel shook his head politely. "I'm here to deliver something." The usher hesitated, his smile faltering slightly. Maria emerged from the SUV, her dress simple but neat, her hands calmly folded in front of her. She stayed a few steps behind Nathaniel, her face composed but unreadable. Several parishioners lingered near the entrance, watching the scene with mild curiosity. Nathaniel held out the folder. "For the priest," he said simply. The usher took the folder reluctantly, sensing the tension but unsure of what to do. He turned and disappeared inside the building. Nathaniel stepped aside, allowing Maria to move closer. Neither of them spoke. Inside the church office, the priest flipped open the folder. His hands, steady from years of sermons and ceremonies, trembled slightly as he read the contents. Outside, conversations slowed. Curious glances turned toward the doors, sensing that something unusual was happening. The young choir volunteer moved to the side of the crowd, peeking around a column to get a better view. Minutes later, the priest emerged, his face pale, the folder clutched tightly in his hand. He cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "I would like to make an announcement," he said, voice carrying across the courtyard. The chatter died instantly. "Effective immediately," he continued, forcing the words out. "Ownership of St. Augustine Church and the surrounding property has been transferred." Gasps rippled through the crowd. "Transferred," the priest repeated, his voice cracking, "to the Langford Foundation." He looked directly at Maria as he said it, his expression a mix of shame and disbelief. Maria met his gaze steadily. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply inclined her head, acknowledging the weight of the moment without a word. Whispers surged through the crowd. Some faces turned red. Some looked away in embarrassment. Others just stared. The same usher who had blocked Maria earlier now shifted uncomfortably, hands clasped tightly in front of him. Nathaniel placed a gentle hand on Maria's back. "Shall we?" he murmured. Maria nodded once. Without another glance at the stunned congregation, she and Nathaniel stepped past the crowd, through the open church doors, and into the place that had once deemed her unworthy. Behind them, the church. Bells rang again, this time sounding more like a reckoning than a welcome. The news spread faster than the priest could contain it. By the time the afternoon sun dipped low, most of the congregation had heard. The Langford Foundation now owned St. Augustine Church. Inside the church office, whispered meetings erupted. Phone calls were made. Messages were exchanged between the wealthier members of the congregation, trying to understand how this had happened and what it meant. Maria sat quietly in one of the pews near the back, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't move, didn't fidget. The very sight of her, calm, present, unashamed, unsettled those who passed by. The senior usher, the same man who had blocked her path just hours earlier, moved stiffly down the aisle, glancing nervously. Toward her, but avoiding eye contact. The young choir volunteer hovered nearby, organizing hymn books with exaggerated care, casting quick glances at Maria every few minutes. There was guilt in his posture, heavy and undeniable. At the front of the church, Nathaniel stood in a quiet conversation with the priest. His tone was calm but firm. "Nothing needs to change publicly," Nathaniel said evenly. "The services continue. The programs continue. But from today forward, this building operates under a different spirit." The priest swallowed hard, nodding. "And if anyone has a problem with that," Nathaniel added, his voice low, "they're welcome to find another house of worship." The priest looked out at the congregation gathering for evening mass, most of whom still didn't fully understand what had changed, and simply nodded again. Near the vestibule, two longtime church donors whispered furiously, shooting dirty looks at Maria as they spoke. "She bought her way in," one woman hissed. "Money doesn't buy grace." Her companion scoffed. "Maybe not, but it buys deeds, and now she owns the keys." The bitterness in their voices was sharp enough to taste. As the organist began warming up, the sound filled the vaulted ceilings with soft, swelling music. The familiar comfort of ritual tried to settle the tension, but it couldn't hide the shift in the room. Maria remained seated, letting the unease swirl around her like a storm she no longer needed to weather. A soft voice interrupted her stillness. "Ma'am?" Maria turned slightly. The young choir volunteer stood a few feet away, twisting the hem of his robe in his hands. He faltered, then took a breath. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened earlier. It wasn't right." Maria looked at him for a long moment, then offered a small nod. No smile, no grand forgiveness, just a simple acknowledgement. "Thank you," she said quietly. The boy seemed to relax slightly, shoulders easing. Behind him, Nathaniel watched the interaction, something warm flickering across his features. The evening mass began. People filed into their usual pews, glancing cautiously at Maria as they passed. Some offered tight, polite smiles, others ignored her completely. The sermon, usually confident and flowing, stumbled tonight. The priest, though trying to maintain his authority, found his words brittle, his hands shaky as he flipped through his notes. The foundation's ownership weighed heavily in the air, a silent audience no sermon could out-preach. At the back, Maria listened, not out of habit, but out of patience. She didn't need their approval anymore. She had never really needed it, only now they couldn't deny her presence. When the offering baskets were passed, Maria reached into her purse. She pulled out a small envelope, not fat, not flashy, and placed it gently into the basket when it came to her. No one saw the amount. No one needed to. It wasn't about spectacle, it was about belonging. Across the aisle, the senior usher caught the motion out of the corner of his eye. His face flushed a deep red. For a moment, he looked like he might cross the aisle, say something, apologize, but he stayed frozen in place, shame rooting him to the floor. The mass ended with a hymn. Voices rose in unsteady unison, filling the old church with familiar, trembling notes. As people exited, small clusters formed, some buzzing with confusion, others avoiding eye contact altogether. Outside, the sky darkened, and streetlights flickered to life. Maria and Nathaniel walked down the steps together, side by side. The young choir volunteer held the door for them, nodding respectfully as they passed. Once outside, Maria paused at the bottom of the steps, looking up at the grand ancient building she now owned. Not for power, not for pride, but for something much harder to define, and infinitely more valuable. Nathaniel leaned closer, his voice low and certain. "You didn't need the deed to belong here," he said. "They were the ones who needed reminding." Maria glanced sideways at him, her eyes soft but unwavering. "I didn't buy a seat," she said simply. "I just took back the open door they tried to close." Together, they walked into the night, leaving behind a church forever changed, not by money, but by the quiet, unstoppable dignity of one woman, who refused to disappear. A few days later, Maria returned to the church, alone this time. No grand entrance, no announcement, just a woman in a plain blue dress walking quietly toward the building that once turned her away. The congregation had adjusted, at least on the surface. There were still glances, still whispers, but the open hostility had dulled into something less visible, more tired. Maria didn't sit in the back this time. She chose a pew closer to the center, her posture straight, her hands calm. The priest caught sight of her as he moved through the vestibule. His expression tightened briefly before smoothing into something resembling professionalism. He offered a small nod, the bare minimum acknowledgement. Maria returned it with a polite, neutral smile. During the service, Maria listened without reacting. The hymns rose and fell, the prayers murmured, the rituals followed. It should have felt like home. But it didn't. There was a coldness now. Not from the stone walls or the high ceilings, but from the people themselves. A distance no deed could bridge. After the final hymn, Maria remained seated as the church emptied around her. One by one, families gathered their children, fixed their coats, and filed past her without stopping. The young choir volunteer hesitated by the door, offering a small wave before disappearing into the crowd. Maria waited until the last of the noise faded. Nathaniel was waiting outside in the car, but he hadn't insisted on coming in. He understood. This was something she needed to do alone. The priest approached her cautiously, clearing his throat as he neared. "Mrs. Langford," he said stiffly. "Father," Maria replied, her voice steady. "I trust you found the service acceptable." Maria tilted, her head slightly. "It was what it's always been," she said quietly. The priest shifted, uncomfortable. He clasped his hands behind his back, a gesture of habit more than confidence. "I understand this situation is unique," he said carefully. "Transitions take time, for everyone." Maria studied him, not unkindly. "I didn't come here to change your church, Father," she said. "I came here because it was supposed to be open to everyone." The priest nodded, but it was the kind of nod that ended conversations rather than opening them. Maria stood, smoothing the front of her dress. "I'm not asking for a seat at the table," she added, voice soft but unwavering. "I'm asking you to remember why there's a table at all." For a moment, the priest seemed about to reply, but no words came. Maria offered a polite nod, stepped past him, and walked toward the exit. Outside, the sky was heavy with clouds, the early signs of a coming storm. Nathaniel stood by the car, leaning casually against the hood. When he saw Maria, he straightened, his face open and patient. She approached slowly, the weight of the morning settling around her shoulders. Nathaniel opened the passenger door, but didn't speak. Maria hesitated by the car, then shook her head slightly. "Let's not leave just yet," she said. Nathaniel closed the door without question and followed her gaze. Across the street was a small cafe, mostly empty, a few tables set outside under a faded awning. Maria walked toward it without waiting. They ordered coffee, took a table near the edge, and sat in silence for a while, watching the church across the street. Nathaniel finally broke the quiet. "You don't owe them anything, you know," he said. Maria stirred her coffee slowly. "It's not about owing." "Then why stay?" Maria didn't answer immediately. She looked at the church, the heavy doors, the stained glass windows catching the grey light. "Because if I leave now," she said finally, "they win." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, studying her with something close to admiration. "And if you stay?" Maria smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried 100 small wounds. Beneath it, then maybe the next woman who walks through those doors won't have to fight just to sit down. Nathaniel nodded, understanding more in that moment than words could explain. He reached across the table, covering her hand with his. They sat like that for a long time, two quiet figures facing a building that had tried to close itself off, and finding somehow that dignity didn't need permission. The first drops of rain began to fall, dotting the pavement around them. Nathaniel glanced up at the darkening sky. "Time to head home?" he asked. Maria shook her head again, her smile a little stronger this time. "No," she said. "Not yet." They sat there, letting the rain fall, letting the weight of the world drip away. 2 weeks later, St. Augustine Church prepared for its biggest event of the year, the annual Grace Gala, a fundraiser attended by city leaders, wealthy donors, and old families whose names lined the plaques inside the sanctuary. It was an evening built on appearances. Elegant gowns, tuxedos, champagne. Smiles stretched a little too tight. For years, Maria had watched such events from a distance, heard about them, seen the pictures. This time, she wasn't watching. This time, she had a seat inside. As guests filed into the church's side hall, transformed with rented chandeliers and velvet ropes, Maria entered through the front doors. Heads turned immediately. She didn't wear designer labels. No diamonds glittered at her throat. Just a simple, fitted navy dress and a small silver cross resting against her collarbone. Elegant, understated, unapologetically herself. The senior usher spotted her from across the room. For a moment, he froze, remembering too well the day he blocked her path. He looked away quickly, pretending not to see. Nathaniel followed a few steps behind her, in a sharp black suit, his expression neutral but unmissable. People recognized him now, and through him, recognized her. Maria moved with calm precision, greeting no one, seeking no approval. She wasn't there to impress them. She was there to remind them. At the far end of the hall, the priest took the small stage set up for the evening speeches. His eyes swept the room once, hesitating when they landed on Maria before he began. "Welcome, everyone," he said, voice echoing slightly. "Tonight, we come together to support our missions and to celebrate the grace that binds us as a community." The crowd murmured polite approval. Champagne glasses clinked. Laughter floated in shallow bursts. Maria moved toward the side of the room, taking a seat at a small table near the edge, half in shadow. The first hour passed in a blur of speeches, donations, and social posturing. Then came the awards, a tradition where the church recognized individuals who had contributed significantly to the community. The priest adjusted the microphone, his hand trembling slightly. "Our final recognition tonight," he said, clearing his throat, "is someone whose contribution goes beyond material support." A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. Maria's name had not been listed on any of the invitations or programs. "Fei Jabakinchiti," priest continued, forcing the words out. "A woman whose quiet dignity and generosity have challenged us to be better stewards of the spirit we claim to serve." He paused. People began to murmur, shifting in their seats. The priest turned and, with visible effort, gestured toward Maria. "Mrs. Maria Langford." The room fell into stunned silence. Maria remained seated for a moment longer, letting the weight of it settle. Then she stood, her movements unhurried, and made her way to the stage. She didn't rush. She didn't bow her head. She simply walked, one step after another, until she stood beside the priest. He handed her a small plaque engraved with the words, "For reminding us what grace truly means." Maria accepted it with a nod, but didn't immediately step away. She turned to the microphone, scanning the room. Not everyone met her gaze, but enough did. Her voice, when it came, was calm and clear. "I didn't build this place," she said. "I didn't build its walls, or its traditions, or its legacy." She paused, letting the silence breathe. "But I did believe it belonged to more than just the ones who could afford a seat." The tension in the room thickened, but no one interrupted. Maria's eyes found the senior usher, standing stiffly near the entrance. She offered him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not of anger, but of something harder to carry. Forgiveness. "I was told once," Maria continued, "that grace isn't earned, it's offered." She looked down, at the plaque in her hand, then back at the crowd. "I'm just here to make sure the doors stay open. For everyone." There was no applause. Not at first, just a deep, echoing silence. Then, somewhere near the back, a single pair of hands clapped, softly at first. Then another. And another. Until the hall filled with a sound that wasn't quite celebration, but wasn't polite obligation either. It was something real. Maria inclined her head once more and stepped away from the microphone, walking back to her table without waiting for the priest to reclaim the stage. Nathaniel met her halfway, his expression unreadable, his hand steady as he reached for hers. "You didn't just walk through the doors," he said quietly. "You built a new one." Maria squeezed his hand, her smile faint but full of something stronger than victory, something closer to peace. The gala continued, but the air had shifted. People still talked, still laughed, still posed for pictures, but the center of gravity had changed, and they all knew it. No matter how much silk and silver and ceremony they wrapped around the evening, the truth was simple. They hadn't opened the door for Maria. She had opened it herself, and now it would never close again. In the days following, the gala, the atmosphere inside St. Augustine Church changed, not overnight, but in steady, undeniable ways. The judgmental glances dulled, the sharp whispers faded, and the spaces that once felt closed began to crack open. Some parishioners, the ones who had once looked through Maria as if she didn't exist, now nodded stiffly in passing, unsure of how to bridge the chasm, but knowing they could no longer ignore her. Others, mostly the younger members and the quiet ones at the edges, found small ways to show their support: a smile, a door held open, a seat saved beside them. Maria accepted it all with the same quiet grace she had carried. From the beginning, she didn't seek apologies. She didn't demand recognition. She simply stayed. One morning, Nathaniel waited for her outside the cafe where they often sat after services. He sipped his coffee slowly, watching her approach across the street. Maria slid into the chair opposite, him, a light breeze tugging at the hem of her simple dress. Nathaniel set down his cup. "How long are you going to keep doing this?" he asked. Maria smiled faintly. "As long as it takes." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You could build your own church," he said. "Buy any building you want. Start from scratch. Fresh walls, no history, no battles." Maria shook her head. "It's not about walls," she said quietly. "It's about the door." Nathaniel didn't argue. He understood better than anyone. Across the street, the church doors stood, open, sunlight pouring through the entrance. A small group of teenagers stood awkwardly on the steps, ripped jeans, hoodies, worn sneakers, clearly out of place amid the polished shoes and tailored suits. Maria watched as an older parishioner frowned at them, arms crossed disapprovingly. The teenagers shifted uncomfortably, muttering among themselves, preparing to leave. Maria rose from her chair without a word. Nathaniel watched her go, pride flickering across his features. Maria crossed the street calmly, her footsteps sure. She approached the teenagers with a warm, steady smile. "Looking for the service?" she asked. They hesitated, glancing at each other, unsure whether they were being mocked. Maria gestured toward the open doors. "It's for everyone," she said simply. "No dress code, no membership fee." The boys laughed awkwardly, but the tension eased. Slowly, uncertainly, they followed her inside. From his seat at the cafe, Nathaniel watched the scene unfold, watched as Maria walked through the grand doors, the teenagers trailing behind her, a living testament to the spirit that should have always lived there. Inside, heads turned, some faces tightened in disapproval, others softened. Maria didn't waver. She guided the boys to a pew near the back, offering a brief smile before taking her own seat nearby. The service began, prayers rising into the air, voices blending into one. No one forced the boys to leave. No one dared. Across the aisle, the senior usher who had once blocked Maria's path now stood silently by the door, his posture stiff but his hands loose at his sides, no longer a gatekeeper. As the final hymn filled the space, Maria closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. This was what belonging was supposed to feel like. Not permission, not pity, just presence. After the service, as people filed out, one of the teenagers shuffled over to her. "Thanks, ma'am," he mumbled, scratching the back of his head. Maria smiled softly. "Come back next week," she said. "Bring your friends." The boy nodded, a small, genuine grin breaking across his face before he ran to catch up with his group. Outside, the afternoon sun warmed the steps of the church. Nathaniel waited at the bottom, leaning casually against the stone railing. Maria descended slowly, the plaque from the gala, now quietly mounted on the church's inner wall, glinting in the light behind her. Nathaniel offered his hand. "Ready to go?" he asked. Maria took it, feeling the solid strength of it wrap around her fingers. "Not going anywhere," she said with a quiet smile. Nathaniel laughed under his breath, squeezing her hand gently. They walked down the street together, past rows of blooming flowers and weathered brick walls, leaving behind a building that, for the first time in a long time, felt lighter, not because it had changed completely, but because someone had decided it was worth staying to change. Months later, a small crowd gathered outside what used to be the church's closed-off side wing, a forgotten space with boarded windows and broken pews, long dismissed as unusable. But today, sunlight streamed through newly installed glass, and a polished wooden plaque stood beside the entrance. It read, "The open door room, for everyone who was once told not you." Maria stood beside it, a soft smile resting on her face. No microphone, no formal ribbon. Just her, a small group of volunteers, a handful of new faces, and a quiet sense of something real. Inside, the space had been transformed. Rows of mismatched chairs lined the walls. A free clothing rack stood near the entrance. A coffee table with used books sat in the corner, surrounded by armchairs that didn't match, but invited you to sit anyway. It wasn't perfect, but it was open. Nathaniel watched from a distance, leaning against the same stone railing he always did. He didn't need to be front and center. This was her place. People entered slowly, a young mother holding her child, a man with weathered hands and a guarded look, two teenagers from the street corner who had come back week after week. The choir volunteer, now more confident, older, by the months, stood by the entryway, handing out simple welcome notes. He wore the same robe, but with a different kind of posture now. The senior usher arrived late. He didn't say much, but he walked up to Maria, paused for a long second, and extended his hand. She took it without hesitation. "Thank you," he said quietly. Maria didn't answer with words, just a nod and the kind of look that said, "We're not erasing what happened, but we're starting again." Later that afternoon, as the crowd thinned and the space settled, Maria found herself standing near the entrance alone. The light from the stained glass window painted colors on the tiled floor. Nathaniel walked in, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. He handed one to her without a word. They stood there in silence, watching the space fill, not with grandeur or ceremony, but with presence. People who hadn't felt welcome before were now walking in like they belonged. Because they did. Nathaniel finally spoke. "You remember when you told me this wasn't about winning?" Maria nodded. "I still believe that," she said. Nathaniel tilted, his head. "Then what is this?" Maria looked around the room, at the woman helping a teenager choose a blazer for his first job interview, at the choir boy laughing with the kids near the bookshelf, at the usher who now helped clean up crumbs from a cookie plate. "This," she said slowly, "is about what happens when you stay, when you don't walk away, even after they tell you to." Nathaniel nodded, his expression warm. "You built something they couldn't lock up this time," he said. Maria smiled. "I didn't build it," she said. "I just kept the door open long enough for them to walk in." As they stood together, a young girl approached, maybe 10 or 11, her clothes a little too big, her hair tied up in a rush. She looked up at Maria, wide-eyed. "Is this your place?" she asked. Maria knelt so they were eye to eye. "No," she said with a soft smile. "It's yours." The girl blinked. "Can I come here whenever I want?" Maria took her hand. "That's the whole point." The girl grinned and skipped off toward the bookshelf. Nathaniel looked at Maria, pride flickering behind his calm. "You could have built this anywhere," he said. Maria shook her head. "No, it had to be here. It had to be the place that told me I couldn't." Nathaniel raised his coffee cup in a quiet salute. "To open doors," Maria tapped her cup against his. "To never needing permission again." As the light from the stained glass window shifted and voices filled the room, the past faded behind them, not forgotten, not erased, but no longer in charge. This place wasn't about proving them wrong anymore. It was about proving everyone else right, the people who showed up, sat down, and stayed, because now no one would ever hear "not you" at the door again. Please hit the subscribe button for more stories.